My name is Ryan Shanahan. I'm from the Vera Institute of Justice, and I welcome you to what I hope will be an amazing and interactive conversation about young people in our justice system. I'm going to start by asking how many people here believe that young people are different, right? Okay. So I'm going to suggest something to us. Can we just skip over that part where we have to justify that this is a thing, right? And a lot of people use the justification around the brain science, and we're going to interrogate some of that on the panel today. And we're going to expand the conversation beyond the brain science, because while I think someone earlier today used the words like echo chamber, we might be an echo chamber. We think that young people are different, and the brain science has helped us make that argument finer. There's a few reasons why we're going to get into in a minute as to why we think that's should be a little bit different. So at the Vera Institute of Justice, I'm privileged to work on a project that focuses on radically transforming the living conditions for young people who find themselves in jails and prisons. And we've steered away from making arguments about brain science for a couple of reasons. But the first, and we're gonna all be brave together here today, is there anyone in the room who's under 25? Yeah. How does it feel when people are like, well, it's just that your brain isn't like fully cooked, so sorry, dude. Like, that feels shitty, right? Like, let's just call that what it is. And if you had told me at 20 that I wasn't grown, we would have had to have some words. So, but beyond the fact that that kind of feels shitty, it also does another thing, right? It assumes a culpability of anyone over 25. So 26 and up, good luck, Godspeed. May the weight of the justice system fall on top of you. And so the divide of having young adults as a focus because of brain science becomes problematic in that area. But there's also another thing. There's some people who are not in our echo chamber who just don't want to hear it. They're just like, the brain science is actually not conclusive, and you're not going to sway me that way. So for the work that I do around young people in prisons at the Vera Institute, we do it for 4 reasons. We have 4 justifications why this particular group of folks are key to hone in on. The first is that if we want to end mass incarceration, young people are a great place to start. So we work in the state of Connecticut where 70% of the people that are currently incarcerated came into that system between the ages of 18 and 25. And so if we can do something differently between those ages and treat people with humanity and dignity, if they end up in our prison systems, we might have the ability to change a larger spectrum of people along that age spectrum. Also, young people just make up more of our prisons, right? So they're filling our prisons and jails at greater numbers than folks who are older than them. And some people might say that's because of the brain science, and that's fine. We're totally fine with that. I'm not trying to dismiss brain science, let me be clear. The second reason that the Vera Institute of Justice focuses on young people is around our commitment to race equity. So the things that we see around racial and ethnic disparities in the justice system are even more acute for young people. So whereas the statistics say that that black men are 6 times more likely to go to prison, when you look at young black men in the ages of 18 to 25, they're actually 9 times more likely to go to prison. So we know that if we can do something different for young men, we are pushing forward a race equity agenda. The third is around safety. So for people in prison and in the communities, young men of color specifically are at greatest risk. So if we can do something differently for young men of color, we're making places more safe, we're making communities more safe, and we're making prisons more safe. Young men of color are the most likely to die of homicide in prisons. That's a fact that, frankly, I did not know, and I've been in this field since 1999, but I did not know that before I started looking into young people in prisons, that they are the most likely to die of homicide of any other age group in prison. So safety is a real critical thing. We want all of our communities to be safe, and we want people who live and work in prisons to be safe. And if we can focus on young people, we'll have a better chance of that. And then the last is success. So on every metric of success, young people fare worse. So if we can do something different for young people, we can have more successful outcomes, whether that be around high school graduation rates, college graduation rates, or recidivism, doing better on parole, and having more success while they're in prison. So as you can see, you might have been a little bit tricked into this panel. You thought you were coming here to talk about young adults and brain science, but we're going to have a conversation that are focused on these 4 things: ending mass incarceration, advancing race equity, having safety and success for our young people. Is that okay? Does anyone at this point now want to get up and leave? No, good, I'm glad. So I'm gonna go through our panel here, and I'm gonna take a note from our facilitators this morning and know that you can read all of their amazing bios online. But I'm gonna have them quickly introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about the work that they do that might not be in their bio that is specific to young people. So we're just gonna go left to right here, and then we're gonna get into the panel discussion. But right now, just an introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Mulhern. I work for Mayor Walsh in Boston. Much of what we're doing out of the Mayor's office in Boston, in the Office of Public Safety, is trying to figure out different ways using opportunity to really enhance public safety in our city. It's all in the context of Mayor Walsh, his strong belief in redemption and second chances. He's someone that went into recovery at the age of 29, found himself in a rehab with a robe and slippers on, and reinvented himself. And that's kind of the culture and the spirit that we're trying to bring to the work in Boston.
My name's Anthony Robles. I'm an organizer with the Youth Justice Coalition in Los Angeles, California. Me, myself, I was first arrested at like 12 or 13, and I was, criminalized since that age. I'm constantly being arrested, locked up, stuff like that, up until just last year, 2017, was I finally got off probation, and right now is like the freest I've ever been from the criminal justice system. I'm only 25 years old. But I recently graduated from Cal State LA last year, and now I'm full-time organizing with the Youth Justice Coalition, and we're a youth-led, formerly incarcerated-led, system-impacted-led grassroots organization that works to end mass incarceration and the criminalization of Black and brown youth. And we have our own school called, it's a continuation school called Free LA. So students that have been pushed out of their traditional schools, they come to our school and they can get their high school diploma. And yeah, we work on all facets of youth justice and criminal justice related issues.
My name is Doug Halbert. I'm the elected city prosecutor from the city of Long Beach in Long Beach, California. And our office is known for a number of diversionary programs, not just those that focus on young adults, but across the spectrum. And we work with community-based organizations in a way that a lot of prosecuting agencies don't. We actually bring them into our office and get a lot of our ideas directly from the community.
My name is Nina Aledort, and I'm with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. And we really work at the intersection of child welfare, homelessness, juvenile justice, human trafficking, and sort of the young people who are in the criminal justice system. And we have, over the last couple of years, in partnership with the Division of Criminal Justice Services and the Unified Court System, formed the Partnership for Youth Justice for New York State, where the 2 agencies and the 1 individual branch of government of the courts have really worked together to align our vision about what we wanted to see, focusing on race equity and gender identity equity in the youth justice system in New York State.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Pacheco, and I feel like I'm almost like a co-host because I'm a student here at John Jay. I'm in my junior year. I'm also the co-founder of this app that's in the development stage called Connector. It's going to be focused on making the job market more equitable for people who are formerly incarcerated and people who are justice system impacted. Had a fellowship at Vera, so I'm not going to go down that list, but something that's really important that I want to note that I recently was selected for. I'm a U.S. delegate for this program called the Future Leaders Connect, which is housed out of the British Council across the pond. And so this has kind of made me start expanding the way I'm looking at these issues of justice from a global perspective, because it's very, I think the least difficult aspect of it is looking at it from a local standpoint, even though there's, tension. But how do we see these like solutions fitting into like the globalized world we've already moved into? And so that's what I have to offer. I'm also formerly incarcerated, shameless plug. So.
And you're going to be fine because you're already using terms like across the pond, which is very well done. So we're going to start off. I want to actually pitch it to Nina because I'm really interested in this. Am I doing that? Is that me doing that? No? Great. I would do whatever. I would stop whatever I was doing that was making that noise. But when we think about these four justifications for looking and concentrating on young people, and we think about ending mass incarceration, how do you see the state's role of doing that? And do you think that young people are a key to ending mass incarceration?
So that's a kind of a softball question. So
You're
thank
welcome.
you. I'm just wondering the slides, whether we can show them at all, just to sort of frame this conversation. Just to give, New York State is on the precipice, starting on Monday, of changing how we treat 16 and then consequently 17-year-olds as 16 and 17-year-olds. So I would say that we're about to sort of amp up what we've already done in terms of our reform. I think one of the things for folks to realize is that New York State has been doing juvenile justice reform for over 10 years, and really that we are the success story that by decarcerating young people, by really creating the community-based options for them, and addressing the fact that you can keep most young people safely in their communities, we are the story that our communities keep getting safer, right? Everything, all of the key crime indicators continue to go down even as we have fewer and fewer kids in the deepest end. And if we're just looking at how few kids are actually touching detention, you're only getting half the story. This is really the big story, is that all of our age groups are seeing fewer crime indexes. So we're not just having a light touch with younger kids. We are in fact impacting the adult behaviors by keeping them out of the sort of slipstream of deepest end. So the next slide. For folks who are from New York and know the history, I worked at the New York City Department of Juvenile Justice in 2006 to 2010, when on a daily basis we had over 300 kids just in New York City in secure detention. I oversee all of detention, so I see the numbers daily. We have fewer than 100 kids in secure detention for all of New York State. That's an astonishingly low number. Somebody once said that you want government to be small enough that you could drown it in a bathtub. You can almost drown detention in a bathtub, although that's about to change. But that's, again, less than 100 kids for a state as big as New York with as many urban areas as we have, tells you that we're really on the right path. And then the next slide is really important that we don't lose sight of this, that some kids have benefited more than others. And really that where there was disparity before, what we have uncovered is that there is even greater disparity now, that white youth seem to have benefited more from these opportunities. We don't exactly know why. We're putting a lot of effort into training judges and probation and attorneys and DSS on implicit bias through multiple streams. We're all working together through that partnership to really hit all of our systems to understand that this is not the story. This ultimately is just as important, if not more important, than how many. It's even more important to understand who. So I just wanted to share those so that folks got a sense of sort of where New York State has gone in the last 10 years, but also understanding that we have what looks like a kind of intractable problem that we are taking very square aim at by making sure that we're looking at the data all the time, that there's not a data point that we aren't looking at by disparities. And we include, although it's not here, gender disparities, because young women of color, particularly African American Black women, are even more deeply impacted, and young women who are gender nonconforming tend to be even more deeply impacted by the disparities. But I can say, to your first question, if you go back to that first slide, I think that by really focusing on creating and investing in community-based options, when you can keep a kid in the community safely, and those two, not every kid can be kept in the community safely, and that's a reality, but when you can keep a young person in the community safely, you can pick the fruit of that by having them not get arrested as they age up, because you've created the off-ramp and into the on-ramp to sort of productive citizenship, and the off-ramp off of their sort of assumed trajectory up and into the adult criminal justice system.
You said so many important things, and I'm going to put a pin for us around the concept of whether or not we can not keep every kid in the community safely. I'm going to put a pin in that. We're going to make sure that we come back to that. One of the things that I found striking was that New York we see the same trends around the country that we're seeing in New York, where the further you get into the justice system trajectory, the more likely it is that you're going to see more and more Black and brown young people. And so, Doug, I'm really interested from your angle as a prosecutor who's sort of closer to that front end of the system, but has a lot of power about who gets routed into that deeper end of the system, what you think the role of a prosecutor is for doing these interventions around young people and treating them differently.
I think that prosecutors could and should have a huge role, and I say that because prosecutors make the decision on whether or not a case gets filed at all. A prosecutor makes the decision about what charge gets filed. That's significant because with determinate sentencing, frequently, whatever the conviction is, a judge's hands are somewhat tied. He has to give a sentence in a certain area. Prosecutors also decide the outcome of most cases. Although there's a judge and there's a defense attorney involved, there's no question that the offer that the prosecutor puts on the case has a lot of weight in determining what comes out of it. So prosecutors, I think for many years, up until recently, I think have spent a lot of time focusing on their job in a very narrow view: review cases, file in court, secure conviction, and ask for a sentence that is the most severe sentence. And prosecutors that look very narrowly at their job in those terms miss the fact that they could be a huge player in changing these outcomes. Because you're right, we're at the beginning of this. What's better than spending money in reentry is not having someone going into the system without a question. So prosecutors do have, I think, some hurdles they have to overcome. Surprisingly, I don't know that external politics is nearly as big a significant hurdle as internal politics sometimes, meaning the prosecutors who are the supervisors and often the heads of offices, they work their way up through a system that was one where tough on crime was rewarded politically. And so for them, they're just not mentally or emotionally in tune to changing. But externally, prosecutors, and we heard from one this morning from Chicago, prosecutors that want to change the system are in a great position to do that. They have to collaborate, which again is not something prosecutors are used to doing, working with community-based organizations, working with research scientists and data analysts. That's not something that prosecutors traditionally have done, but the role of the prosecutor, I think, is often missed in a lot of the discussion because people kind of give us a pass and they focus on the legislature, they focus on the judges. The prosecutors could make a more significant difference in the outcome in the criminal justice system probably than any other player. And why they're not, there's a lot of factors, but they could. They could and they should.
And do you want to tell us a little bit about how your office is doing that?
Sure, and I don't think I'm going to play that video only because I think we want to keep it conversational, but our office has a number of diversionary programs. We have going back several years.
I think it might be me.
Is it me? It's our moderator. She takes blame for it. It's called giving yourself accountability, even though it's not her, I'm sure.
Taking one for the team.
Well, our office, about 2 years ago, we were involved in a youth violence prevention effort that got us to talk to some Department of Justice officials. Barack Obama took on criminal justice as an issue that I don't think I've seen any other president do. And one of the things they talked about was treating young adults a little differently. And for those of you who aren't as steeped in the law, in California it's 18, but in every state, I think, there's a very bright line between the juvenile system and the adult system. The day before your 18th birthday, you go to bed as a juvenile. And you are treated, if a crime occurs the day before your 18th birthday, you're treated as a juvenile, where the focus is rehabilitation. But on your 18th birthday, you're held accountable as an adult. You're treated under the adult laws. A lot of prosecutors don't distinguish by age because you don't want to treat people unfairly. This is the charge, this is the crime, this is the outcome, this is the sentence we're looking for in a lot of cases. So our office started a jobs-based diversion program specifically for our 18 to 24-year-old population. And we picked that group because there happened to be a Department of Labor grant that allowed for concierge job assistance and job placement that was given to our local workforce investment network. So they actually wanted us to refer to them justice-involved persons before they had a conviction that made it harder for them to get a job. So we divert 93% of the cases that go into our PATH program, which stands for Promising Adults, Tomorrow's Hope. 93% of the cases that go into that program are pre-filing. So there is no case in court. There's nothing to get dismissed. There's nothing to get expunged. And what do they have to do? Well, they have to go to a 6-hour course and meet with a jobs counselor who does a one-on-one assessment and helps place that person in a paying internship or a job. They get resume writing workshops. They get interview skills workshops. And the entire goal is not to punish. It's not to create a fine. It's to return that person to society more employable than they were before. I didn't expect the success we had because the group that we were diverting jumped on the chance. Every time we offered this program, they were very involved in participating because they view where they're at as a place that could benefit from job training and job placement. We have a lot of youth who, if they don't get employed at that early age, we're still going to have issues with them when they're 20 and 30 and 35. That's so critical, that early point. But we have a number of diversionary programs that deal with substance abuse and mental illness. And I think just as a goal, this has really changed in the last several years. Prosecutors really are looking for solutions and collaborations. It's just not easy for them because that's not their traditional role.
That's really great. It's helpful. Thank you. Stephen, I want to pitch it to you. It is. It's me, y'all. I don't know what I'm doing. Does anyone have any advice?
Can we all act like that's not going on? Let's just act like it's not happening for the rest of the day.
Play it cool, y'all. Play it cool. So Stephen and I had talked before the panel, and I really wanted you to think through these components or these arguments and justifications of safety and success around young people. So could you start by just reflecting back a little bit your thoughts around what you think about when we talk about safety and young people?
So this is a question I love, mainly because I really think that we're at a day and age where we have to rethink this idea of safety. Like literally all of you in this room, all of us on this panel, everybody in this entire society. I'll use an anecdote just to kind of bring it real down to ground level. Who's familiar with gentrification? Raise your hand. Good, very informed room. I love it. So you've all heard the example of, young black person, typically male, walking down a dark block in a neighborhood that's probably not so safe. And somebody, we're using, kind of typical stereotypes for the sake of time. But white lady just moves into the neighborhood with her purse, clutching it as this young male walks past her. Now, I live in a neighborhood that's currently going through gentrification, and many of my friends live in neighborhoods that are going through gentrification. I can tell you, and I'm waiting for the news because the news will be all over it when it happens. But I can tell you that is the safest person in the most violent neighborhood at that given point in time. And the reason being, some of that stuff is underneath the stats Nina talked about, is across race and across socioeconomic status, because even poor white people experience this stuff, or impoverished white people, I should say, are treated differently at the hands of our judicial system, at the hands of law enforcement, at the hands of a prosecutor's office. All of these things are into the stats. So if you really want to look into it, it's definitely fact-checked. With that being said, you have to keep in mind power dynamics that we all carry when we walk into a space, because it's all contextualized in that place and time and current moment.
So, Dan, I'd love to hear from you about, to build on what Stephen was saying and really helping people be prepared for success. How does your project or the program that you run strategize around that? And what are the operational hurdles to it? Or are there none and everyone's just being super successful in Boston?
So to very quickly piggyback on something that Stephen said, the whole premise of the stuff that we do in Boston is that none of us are just one thing. And that means any young person in any neighborhood under any circumstance that may or may not have made a mistake that may have led to a certain consequence, that mistake or consequence shouldn't define them moving forward. And we shouldn't be talking about young people only in the context of what they've done wrong. We've moved the narrative in Boston to what you can do right with the correct kind of support. So what I think is being asked of me is Mayor Walsh put this initiative on the table called Operation Exit. We looked at the city of Boston, and some of you may or may not know this, but building is booming in Boston. We have somewhere in the range of $7 to $8 billion committed to development in the city for the next 5 years, and I believe that doubles in the next 10 years. Our mayor is a mayor that, as I mentioned to you, believes very strongly on second chances, but also comes from the labor universe. One of the first conversations that I had with him when I moved into my role with him, and I'll put this in context, prior to moving into my role with the mayor, I was the chief of the gang unit in Suffolk County for quite some time, supervised all gang prosecutions in Boston. My caseload was gang-related homicides and handled all shootings and firearm violence in Boston. I think when my role was created, most in the city thought that it would be an enforcement-driven role, working very closely with the police department, and it was quite the opposite. My first conversation I had with the mayor was that if we didn't put the right kind of opportunity on the table and support that opportunity and think about violence and safety long term, not in a reactionary sense, not in a deployment sense, but thinking about addressing the root causes of what leads to violence to begin with in our community, then we'd really never be successful. Every year we'd be talking about, oh, we're down 15% in shootings, oh, we're up 6% in homicides. Our goal in Boston is 0. The mayor's goal in Boston is 0. We want to be a city of 0 homicides and 0 shootings. So we created this pre-apprenticeship program. It's 3.5 weeks long. We're close to 100 graduates, which may seem modest to this room in the past 4 years. 100 formerly incarcerated, formerly gang involved, formerly victimized, formerly traumatized young men and women. We've moved them through this 3.5-week pre-apprenticeship program. The guarantee for us in Boston has been 100% placement in the trade unions. Whether you agree with unions or not, we in Boston felt very strongly, the mayor felt very strongly, that the solution wasn't a job, it was a career path with security, with a pension, an annuity, health care, dental care. We were also told very quickly when the mayor and I kicked this idea around that our young people couldn't be in the same room together, right? They said that if a young person was gang involved, he most certainly couldn't be in the room with someone from the other side. Gang violence in Boston is a little bit complicated. We don't have a national influence. Ours is neighborhood-driven, street to street. We have a large number of groups with small numbers, so the conflict is sometimes difficult to define because of those small numbers reaching out to other groups in collaboration. So I asked the mayor's permission to then go to our police commissioner because we needed to have buy-in from our law enforcement partners to say, look, we're going to take the, we're not going to look at low-lying fruit. We're not going to, we want to get to the heart of the violence. We want to stop young people from hurting each other and from dying in our community. The mayor was willing to take that risk. Our police commissioner at the time was. We now have the first African-American police commissioner ever appointed in the city of Boston. He's been in office for 2 months. He is 100% supportive of this initiative. So we put them through the pre-apprenticeship program. We have about an 85, 86, 87% placement rate. Our fourth-year apprentices, so we started in 2014. Our fourth-year apprentices are making upwards of $100,000 a year. To put a class together of 20 costs roughly $56,000 to $59,000. You all in this room are like-minded and understand what it costs to incarcerate one person for a year. So it's been a smashing success for us in Boston. We just started a pilot for some of the older guys that are coming back from the impact of the minimum mandatory sentencing in the 90s. They started yesterday. I had four men in a room yesterday morning with a combined years of incarceration of close to 100 years. That the mayor put an opportunity on the table for them. They all went away for trafficking offenses. They're tied into our recovery work in Boston with some restorative justice meetings. They're making $17 an hour, and we're going to continue to push the envelope. The mayor's going to continue to push the envelope around really redefining what it means to be a safe and healthy city and neighborhood.
So, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, are some placements actually in the city and in the mayor's office and part of the reform movement? Yes or no?
Sure. Yeah, so the mayor felt very strongly he couldn't ask external partners to do all the work and not do it in-house. And so within City Hall, we started a professional pathways program. Not everyone wants to put work boots on and go out on a job site to create pathways to professional jobs within City Hall. We've had significant success in that respect. In our building, in our maintenance department, we have multiple men and women that have come back home to our neighborhoods that are now working in the building as well. So it's also, we're going to be part of the solution in City Hall as well.
Love that. Thank you. And so, Anthony, that leads me to you about the role for young people in the reform movement. So we've heard all of these interventions or thoughts about ending mass incarceration, advancing race equity, safety, success. But tell me what you think the role for young people should be in that movement.
So being in Los Angeles, the youth in Los Angeles have a unique role in the broader movement, because Los Angeles is basically the epicenter of mass incarceration and the epicenter of youth criminalization. Like, for example, the New York juvenile justice system is run by the Office of Family and Children Services, as opposed to LA County. It's the LA County Probation Department, which is a punitive system. So this is, a lot of these policies and things that we're dealing with on a national scale, a lot of them were born in Los Angeles, after, the super predator scare and all that. And LA at one point incarcerated the most youth in the world. Right now we have the largest county jail system in the world, or at least in the country. And the United States deports the most people in the world, and LA County deports the most people in the country. So we're the leaders in a lot of ways, and in a lot of these issues. And I mean leader and not in a good way. So the role of youth in Los Angeles. Am I speaking to? Is it good? Okay. So the youth in Los Angeles have a very unique role, because we've been impacted in such a direct way. Just about every Black and brown youth. Some recent data showed that the youth that are incarcerated right now in LA County, 95% are Black or Latino. So it's basically just us that are being locked up. So right now, our organization is a youth-led org, and so what we do is one of the things we do is to dismantle the systems that have criminalized us and incarcerated us and punished us, by usurping power and resources from the state, from the criminal justice system, and bringing those back to the community. So one of the things we're working on is the countywide youth development and diversion office or program. And right now it's currently in the implementation stage. And this is for youth who come in contact with law enforcement. Law enforcement has the option of, across LA County, the sheriffs, the LAPD, and the other 55 law enforcement agencies have the option of diverting that youth to a community-based organization. The CBO creates does an intake process, and then creates a program for the youth and tries to keep them out of the system. And so that's something that we're part of the implementation, and youth have been at the forefront. When this was originally being talked about and created, it was all system agencies like the DA's office, the sheriff's department, LAPD, those kind of players, and there was no community orgs in these work groups and these meetings. And so we are the ones that started bringing youth and started bringing communities and parents, and now we're part of the implementation work group. And then so another thing we do is we have our own high school. So we have the Free LA High School, and there Stephen was talking about public safety beyond the criminal justice system, beyond just police and prisons. It's about dismantling that, but also creating alternatives and looking at it from a holistic view. And so at our school, it's a police-free zone, so we don't ever have police in the building or come into the building, because that leads to criminalization. And there was a study that recently came out that the United States schools in America have more cops than counselors now, and in LA this is true. And they do random searches in LAUSD every single day. So we don't have cops. Cops aren't allowed, and we use transformative justice, which is restorative justice, to resolve conflicts, hold people accountable, and try to move forward, instead of using punitive tactics. And so we work on dismantling and trying to usurp power and resources and give it back to the community. We also try to create a liberatory space at our organization, at our community building. We're a collective group. We're a horizontal group. We don't have an executive director. We're horizontal. We're all just organizers. So it's about building those liberatory spaces within the system that we're embedded in, and especially in Los Angeles, where police, and the criminal justice system have always been given priority to take control of these matters when it comes to accountability and things like that. And so one of the campaigns we're working on, which is youth-led, and all these demands came from youth. YJC coordinated a survey outreach where we walked all across LA County to gather. I don't remember the number, but it was thousands and thousands of surveys from young people across the county by door knocking. And their demands ended up being that they wanted to take 1% from law enforcement budgets and the system budgets and redirect that into youth development. And now it's 5%. Now the demand is 5%, because in the last 10 years, LAPD's budget has grown by $1 billion. No, that might be the sheriffs. I think the sheriffs grew by $1 billion. LAPD grew about $850 million, and the probation department grew about $450 million in the last 10, 11 years. This is during a recession, a national recession. This is during a time where youth crime rates are at a historic low, especially in LA County, but suppression budgets are still growing, and we can't get none of those for resources for youth, for mental health, for housing. As you know, gentrification's happening everywhere. It's happening in LA too, and at a fast rate. Our building is being knocked down for a train, and we're being gentrified out of our building. So now we're looking for a new building. So all these things are happening, and these budgets are growing, and so youth are demanding that we want 5% from those budgets. The DA's office budget as well, the LA City Attorney, all these different budgets, and reinvest that into youth development. And looking at things from a developmental approach as opposed to a preventative approach, because when we say we want to prevent violence, youth violence, it lends that narrative that youth are prone to violence, so we have to prevent it. And as opposed to looking at the social conditions and looking at our lack of access to jobs, lack of access to education, and saying, no, we need develop resources that can help develop youth and go beyond the social conditions that we grew up in, which is, impoverishment and all that. So I'm kind of a little bit all over the place, but the role of youth is like they have clear demands, especially in LA. We have clear demands, and we're on the front lines, and we go to the meetings, we go to the city council meetings, we go to the county board of supervisor meetings, we do direct actions, and the youth have been at the forefront of all this. And on the state level, I'll end with this, on the state level, we went up to the Capitol, to Sacramento 31 times. YJC alone went up 31 times. Many of those times we took busloads of like 50 people, a lot of youth, a lot of parents, a lot of impacted people, and we worked on a whole array of bills. But the ones that directly impact youth were SB 1391, which would end the transfer of 14 and 15-year-olds into the adult system. So that passed through the legislature and is sitting on the governor's desk right now, and it should be signed. SB 439, which would end the prosecution of children under 12. That passed through the legislature and is sitting on the governor's desk. In each of the last 2 years, about 700 children between 5 and 11 years old were referred to the juvenile justice system, and most of them are like dismissed. But even that process is costly, just going to court and doing all that for just to be dismissed. And then some are thrown into the juvenile justice system. And then SB 607, which would end the willful defiance suspensions across the state, which is a very vague, broad category of suspension that is mostly used on Black and brown kids, LGBT kids, disabled kids. And it's a broad category when you can just say, well, if you're wearing your hood and you don't want to take it off, they can suspend you and you're kicked out of school. And a famous case of a student being kicked out of school was in Florida. There was a boy who was kicked out of school for 2 weeks, suspended. His mom was working. She couldn't take care of him, so she sent him up in his dad's house, and he ended up being killed by George Zimmerman. So I was Trayvon Martin. And so our belief is to keep kids in school. They shouldn't be out of school, and especially for something as vague as willful defiance. So those are bills, state legislation that was passed because of youth organized. Youth went up to the Capitol, met with their senators, met with their the representatives, and for example, for 439, we had a 9, a 10, and 11-year-old lobbying in the Capitol on behalf of themselves, on behalf of we don't want to be in the juvenile justice system, we're tired of it. So to answer your question, the role of youth, they should be at the forefront and at the lead, and they are. And we just have to make their spaces, because a lot of times adults can clog up those spaces. So it's important for us to hear the youth's voice and allow them to take the lead.
It's really inspiring, all the work that you're doing. Yeah. And I myself was inspired this afternoon in the panel right before lunch. What I thought was so inspiring about it was the way that people were able to interact with each other really respectfully, but really through tension, right? There was definitely some disagreements happening on that panel. And so I'm gonna request that we can do that on this panel too, and we can get out of our this is what my program does, and do more of the conversational of getting a little bit into the weeds. And so when I run analysis groups inside prisons where we bring research into prisons and the people who are incarcerated there get to analyze the data for us, we have a couple of ground rules. And one of them is to throw glitter, not shade. We're not going to use that one today unless you want to. But the other one is to disagree with the statement and not the person, right? To have an argument with that statement. And so with that, I want to respectfully ask the panel to sort of grapple with this statement that not every kid can be kept in the community safely. And so I think I'm going to throw it to Stephen and Anthony first, and then we'll hear from other folks.
Great question. It didn't happen. Great question. So I actually had written down like 2 prompts to that statement that was made by Nina. And, you know, I want to throw 2 questions back before I answer. What are the implications of feeling some youth cannot exist in their community safely? Like, we really have to think about that, right? And then, what good is done by the community with another young person coming home after a period of incarceration, right? So, rephrasing that a different way. We know that our current, you know, system of incarceration does not make people better. We have exceptions, right? But essentially, it's destroying human beings, young, older, right? We're just doing it different ways. Majority of the people who get incarcerated come back home, like over 60%. So what good does that do for the community then, right? Those questions might not be so helpful. So to that point, I brought up slavery earlier. We have not dealt with the legacy of slavery. And show of hands, how many people in the room have watched The 13th on Netflix? Not enough. It's a good amount, but like everybody in this room should have seen it. And I'm not calling anybody out, I'm calling you in. It's a great movie just on the like kind of like from a film perspective, right? It's like Ava DuVernay, she did her thing, and everybody that helped. And there's probably some people at this conference that was in the movie, in the film. But we have not dealt with that legacy here. And so when we see things that we feel like we can't identify or we don't know where it's coming from, nope, you're not going to do that, devil. We got to be really, 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 really careful of what kind of message that sends. Because I'm not, one thing for my peace sake, I don't think about why somebody might have said something, right? I deal with what I have in front of me, and I go forward from that because the truth will always come to light. But with that being said, we have to really think about when you say you don't know where something came from or we're trying to figure it out, there's answers in front of us that we're just ignoring. And this is why I say we have to look at history holistically. Let's not, you know, cherry pick which part of history we want to start from. Whether, oh, I think you died. Hello? Okay. Whether it be sexism, whether it be homophobia, transphobia, all of these things have historical roots. Everybody's scared of doing things from a radical perspective. It's just grabbing something from the root. And so, oh, it might, it's me, see? That's why I said ignore it. To that point, we need to understand that incarceration is a way for us to deal with the issues of society that we want to act like don't exist. And when we realize that from our position of power, because yes, extremely marginalized in a bunch of different ways. I come from a single parent household, first generation college student, formerly incarcerated, whatever you want to call it, right? But I'm on this panel right now. And everybody's at different stages in their lives and their development, so we'll respect the nuance, right? But we all have power at some given point. And so if we're not being critical of ourselves, how can I be critical of you, Ryan? How can I do that? But we do it all the time, right? And so to that point, we need to stop casting the responsibility and accountability of ourselves onto others. And that is what the criminal justice system and the judicial system has been used to do. Why? Because we all have bought into this idea of democracy. But we already know it's only the people who make it to the table who have a say. It's not the entire country. This is why we have a 9-year-old and 11-year-old going to the Capitol, right? Like, what were y'all doing at 9 and 11? That's like, I want to cry, you feel me? But we're going to keep it, I'm not going to do that. But to my point, claim accountability and responsibility for yourselves because it's us. It may not be you in the room, but all of these youth, those who were fortunate, had an adult that showed them how to show up in the world. Some didn't. And so for you to hold that person accountable like they had the same tools, the same empowerment, that's what equality justice is. We're saying that everybody came to the table with it. That erases somebody's entire narrative. We need to be equitable. That's why Vera is talking about race equity. If we're not equitable in our approaches, it's assuming people are coming to the table with the same things, and they're not, and we know that. So we got to be really, really careful with this rhetoric we carry out, these narratives, and a lot of it's propaganda, and some of us don't even know we're programmed, right? Before we just say things and not think about the large swathing implications of it. And so that was not a call out on anybody. That was more ideas. I hope right? You know what I'm saying? But that's my response.
Yeah, and I think to Anthony's point of how you can be.
Thank you.
LA, the numbers in LA look like New York City. And so, in fact, we have figured out a way to keep almost all white youth safely in their community, right? We've figured that out. So, Anthony, I mean, I'd love for you to riff off of that idea and speak more about whether or not you think there are youth that we can't serve in the community.
Yeah, so there are ways to keep all youth out of the juvenile justice system, out of the system, and at home, and living their best lives. And so to do that, I didn't even talk about what the demands of the 5% campaign were to do with the money. So like I said, the demand is to take 5% from suppression budgets and any youth development, but that would be enough across the county to create 100 youth centers, hire 1,000 peace builders or like gang intervention workers, and create 50,000 youth. It's all the mics now, and create 50,000 youth jobs across the county. And one of the things we know is that youth unemployment is really, really high. And if we're not in school and if you're not working, then what are we doing? We're getting caught up in the system, and that's because youth are just kind of left out to on their own and just kind of like make it in the world like with yourself. And some people, like Steven was saying, some people are brought to the table. Some people have people to show them, but in like a lot of our communities, there's nobody that brings us to the table, and so we fall into that same cycle of incarceration and poverty and things like that. So I mean, I guess there are solutions to keep us out, and like you said, we figured out how to keep white kids out of the system. Why can't we do it for black and brown kids? And we're finally, especially in California, I can speak to California, and it seems to be true across the country. In California, our voices are finally starting to be heard, especially formerly incarcerated people of color. We've been organizing, our families have been organizing, people inside have been organizing to demand these changes, and slowly but surely we're getting these changes. We're seeing this huge criminal justice reform movement in California and across the country. And in California specifically, it's for 3 reasons. It's because, one, our governor, Jerry Brown, in his first term in the 70s, that was the beginning of the buildup of this massive buildup of the largest carceral system on the planet, which is CDCR. So he's publicly stated he feels a little bit of responsibility for this massive lockup of people. 2 is because, like I said, we've organized people of color, formerly incarcerated people, families, youth have organized. And right now the organizing is really strong, so people hear our voices. We're going to the Capitol. We're taking direct actions. And then 3, which I think is probably the biggest reason, is that the federal government sued the state of California and said that our prisons were overpacked. We had to keep it under 137.5% capacity. So that's why there's a big effort to reduce the population in prison, and just that whole ethos is bleeding into youth as well, because everybody knows if we're not taking care of the youth, and they're the ones that are going to end up in these prisons. So there are solutions. They come from us, from the people impacted, and we're finally being heard and finally being implemented. But and I'll just say this. I don't want to keep talking, but I will say this. A lot of these things are passing and they're great, but then there's implementation, and implementation is the part where people give up, or people stop doing it, because that's when it gets dirty and that's when it gets hard. And I'll just end with that.
So, I mean, you want to clap? Go ahead, clap. Other perspectives on the panel. I mean, again, and we're talking about the statement, because we know Nina. We love Nina. Nina's been doing this very hard work to reduce the imprint of the state on families in New York for so long, and we really respect the work. So, but what do other people think? Do you think that there's...
Sure, I'm gonna be the bad guy here for a second, but so this is what I'll say in my work as a prosecutor, in my role with the mayor. I've gotten heavily involved in the survivor of homicide community. While I was a prosecutor, I had a family member murdered about 1.5 miles from where I grew up, and that case was prosecuted in the same courthouse that I worked in to a not guilty. So I offer that as context for look, the folks that live in our neighborhoods, all of our neighborhoods, want the same thing that they get in neighborhoods that are a little bit more economically well off. But the fact of the matter is, when someone takes someone's life in our community, there's another side to that equation. It was interesting to hear that many in this conversation that we have feel like victims' voices aren't heard enough. And so I'll offer that. The other thing I'll offer is, and I say this very frequently, arrest and incarceration and prosecution is just ugly. It's ugly all the time, just on a human level. I never became a prosecutor with the idea of wanting to incarcerate anyone. That was never in my on my wish list, right? And it most certainly is not on any young person's wish list when they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old, when they're asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Nobody, no young person raises their hand and says, I want to be involved in gun violence. I want to hurt another young person in my neighborhood. But there are consequences for keeping our entire community safe. And unfortunately, at times, it does mean the removal of someone. In many times, for that person's safety as well.
So we are going to switch now to Q&A, and during that time, hopefully you all will be able to jump back in and give your insights and reflections to the statements that were made. So I think what I have to do is run around with this microphone. Is that what's okay? So the person in the striped shirt.
Hi, I have a couple of questions for Ms. Nina. I hoped that you were going to talk about the Raise the Age initiatives that we're going to go on in New York City. So if you can just speak about it briefly, about what your office is doing. And my other question is for Mr. Is it Mulhern? Dan? Okay. So I'm in HR by accident. So one of the things that I really want to see, or actually a question that I have, is what sort of policies are coming out of the mayor's office in your jurisdiction that are sort of maybe looking at how to lax people, or not lax, excuse me, but sort of how to reduce how background checks are made, because I'm sure a lot of the people that are incarcerated may not want to work in a union or do maintenance. They may want to put on a suit and probably do some policy work or work in some sort of government office. So are there sort of policies that are going to help with those sort of avenues for those people?
Sure. You want me to start with that, or which would you like? So the deputy director that works with me, he would not mind me saying this, but my right-hand person that is with me on a day-to-day basis was formerly incarcerated on a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence, and he's part of the mayor's leadership team. And his wife was just elected to Congress, also in Boston. Some of you may have heard a little bit about it. It was a national story. And so I will always tell the truth. The HR angle has not been easy. I've had to kick the door down, sometimes have other people run through the door with me. I have the luxury, though, of having the support of my boss in doing that. We are attempting all sorts of really exciting criminal justice reform issues legislatively in Massachusetts, many of which have just gotten passed, raising the age to 12, which it was entirely ludicrous that it was 7 in our state. And we're doing all sorts of things around expungement, around sealing records. But in the interim, right now, I would suggest very strongly in whatever respective universes you work in, that you're going to have to go to the top and change the culture. I've had to put pen to paper as the director of the Mayor's Office of Public Safety for a candidate coming into our building saying, I have known this candidate for such a time, because we are in that, cover your, yeah, I can say that, right? But, and so we are really pushing the envelope in our city around Corey vendors. We have a Corey vendor program, anyone that does a business with the city of Boston, whether you paint a wall or build a building, you have to sign a contract that suggests that says that you will hire and treat fairly anyone that comes in for an interview that has a past criminal history. So the HR question is one that is really day to day for us still, but we're trying to systemize and institute changes that so that I don't have to put pen to paper to say this person would be a wonderful hire. But.
So I will speak briefly because I could talk for the day about race. But I think the big takeaway about where the state has really focused our efforts, both through the partnership and with the local work, is first of all to help people erase this strange engraved line in New York State brains that there's a difference in this arena between a 15 and a 16-year-old and then a 16 and a 17-year-old. And you know, we've talked about things like the difference is really a sophomore and a junior, right? That's the difference. But really, where we have focused 90% of our work is on the community-based approaches. That this is an opportunity to apply a youth development focus to really look at the equity lens for young people of color and young women, and particularly young women of color and not gender nonconforming young people, to really say, we have done all this great work for the last 10 years in shrinking our system. We are now going to take the exact same approaches and even better ones and now apply them to the 16-year-olds and then a year from now to the 17-year-olds. That if all we're doing is moving the bodies from jail to detention, we've lost the game. That is not what this is about. Yes, it's better to be in a juvenile detention than in a jail in most cases, but that's not what we're looking at. We are really looking at how do we treat young people as young people and afford them the same opportunities for diversion, for services, for opportunities, for the pathway to real citizenship and being on the right path, and not just sort of move the body from one system to another. So that's really been the state's persistent focus, and there's fertile ground for it in many places, and in other places we're continuing to try to find where those seeds will take up. But overall, there's been a lot of receptivity across the state to this idea. We had 18 months to get there, and this, we'll know at midnight on Monday, sort of where we are. But that's really been the general focus around where the biggest efforts and resources and the messaging has been about let young people stay in the communities and get the opportunities to be young people that we want to see for our own children, right? Because it passed the My Kid test.
The person with the tie. It's not many of them.
Hi, this is just a question to the entire panel. One of the things I personally think needs to be done too is looking at the way the initial interaction with the legal system, which is the way police communities, and how it is not equitable in the way, for example, in New York City, they're arresting, even though they weren't supposed to, they're arresting Black and brown people at significantly higher rates for marijuana. And really, like, if we're not doing enough, what needs to be done? And if we are doing something, what is being done to actually address the way police Black and brown communities?
Who wants to take it?
Well, maybe I'll just start the answer off with, I mentioned the role of a prosecutor in deciding how cases are filed and what charges. Prosecutors also have an ability to convene justice partners. And I say that because the police may not listen to a CBO saying this is how you ought to do what you do. But what I've seen is that they are open to listening to prosecutors. So I think there is a role for us outside of our justice role. I think we all have a role in defining the policing that we get. I think it was Robert Kennedy who said we get the policing that we demand. We get the justice we ask for. We get the policing we demand. So I think there's been a huge change in the last several years, and I will tell you, being a police officer today is not an easy job. They are balancing a lot of competing factors. They are making decisions, at least they feel, in a fishbowl where everything they do is going to be second-guessed. that's making it harder to hire new law. At the time we need new blood in law enforcement the most, it's making it harder to bring in. I think there are probably people at John Jay who they want to be police officers. I think that's fantastic. We need more educated people and people that have background in this criminal justice space to actually want to be police officers. So I would say, I don't police, prosecutors don't police the community, but we do have something to say about policies and practices. We can tell the police this is the type of case we will file, and this is the type of case we're not going to file based on the following circumstances. And so we do have a little bit of a role in there, but I think we all do. So just wanted to start off the answer. Anyone else jump in now?
And I would just say, I don't know about for New York specifically, but like in California, marijuana was completely legalized for possession if you're over 21 or over. But I would say in the question about policing black and brown people, what do we do? I think first one of the things is decriminalizing many things, not just drugs, but many things that are criminalized, decriminalizing, taking whole chunks of the criminal code out. That way, people can be charged or can be, funneled into the system. And divesting, I think one of the big things is divesting from law enforcement. I was at a town hall, and another community member said that the sheriff's department was down 1,500 personnel, and that he knows people that don't want to apply because the small reluctancy to work with ICE, which they're not really reluctant to work with ICE, it's really because of the community is holding so much pressure to the sheriffs. They're still working with ICE, but it's really, it's hard. It's a little bit hard for them. And just all the things, just the what's going on between police and communities across the country. Yeah, people. He was saying people. He knows people that don't want to apply, specifically for the sheriff's department in LA. But and then I came up and I said, well, crime rates like across LA County are at lows right now, and especially violent crime and like youth crime is like at historic lows. And then on the report back, one of the sheriff's deputies had for his whole South Patrol, which is the entire southern part of like LA County, said that like we're having a tremendous year in terms of like crime rates. They're really down 21%. Violent crime was down 21% from the year before. And so I'm like, why do they need 1,500 more deputies if crime is on like historic lows? We need more mental health services. We need more housing. We need more youth development. That's what we need, And so divesting, so decriminalizing, divesting, and then diverting people from the criminal justice system. So having like programs where law enforcement has the discretion to divert a young person or any person, not just a young person, any person into like a program, a community-based organization, as opposed to like the system. And then the last thing is like, culture. And it's definitely not diversity in law enforcement because I heard Jason say on the panel earlier that, like black cops are worse on black people. And like in my experience, Latino cops have always been harder on me than white cops, Like a lot of times white cops are really nice to me. But like every time I run into a Latino cop, like or Latina, they have it like out for me. And I'm like, dang, so it's weird. It's not diversity is definitely not I don't think the answer, but I would say decriminalize, divest, and divert. Yeah.
In LA is doing some interesting things. They're let's see that time was me piloting pre-arrest diversion, which is one of the first in the country. Do you want to talk about that at all? Or?
Yeah, there's two pilots in California. One is in San Francisco. The other is in North Long Beach, Compton, and Linwood, which is an area historically that's had a lot of sex work and a lot of drugs, street-level drugs. It's called LEAD, Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. It's big in Seattle. It's big in a couple other cities, but this is the first time California has done any pilot, and there's actually two of them. And we've actually, this is an opportunity for us to learn, not just in the area of drugs and prostitution and sex work. There are other areas we can do pre-arrest, pre-booking diversion as well. But there's a learning curve.
Yeah.
Can I just take a moment to shout a couple people out really quickly? I'm going to start with Adam Foss, who's in the crowd. I know you don't like that, but he's doing work with this organization he founded called Prosecutors Impact. And a lot of what y'all are talking about, he's going right at the heart of that in terms of building culture, making sure that you have sustainable options and how we're looking at prosecution in that system. So I just want to highlight him. I also want to highlight Sergeant Edwin Raymond, who has a lawsuit with the New York Police Department right now. Him and 12 other 12 other police officers of color, black and brown, and it's particularly something that they're looking at is this implementation of quotas, monthly quotas, because and this goes back to what you're talking about, how it's collusion, it's a conspiracy. So this is particularly employed in communities where people live in where they have low socioeconomic status, black and brown communities. The truth of the matter is, especially as it pertains to drugs, black and white people, Latino people, Latinx people are not committing crimes at any different rates. What you have is police in their communities at much different rates. And so if we have a criminal justice, we also have to look at the fact that crime pays, not just from the perspective of somebody committing the crime, but from the people who are protecting the crime. And so, that being said, if you're in a community, you're going to find more crime. That's why I don't like using the term criminal justice. You need a criminal to apply that kind of justice. And I'll repeat that again. I don't like using the term criminal justice because you need a criminal to apply that kind of justice. So we really got to break down. I'm not a linguist, but you really got to think about what you're saying. And like the implications, it's really basic stuff, you know what I mean? And dictionary.com and all of that stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to shout that out because it's really important stuff that's going on outside of the community, even within these systems that I tend to scoff at.
Okay, so we've got a lot of hands up. Here's how we're going to do it. And I know I was joking before about clothing, but I'm doing that because I cannot assume anyone's gender in the room. So facilitator pro tip, talk about clothing, not people's gender. Next time you're facilitating it. Okay, so we're going to do the person with the black and white polka dot situation, and then we're going to do the black and white diamond situation, and then there was a hand over here. The person with the beautiful cream-colored scarf. Okay.
Very descriptive.
And then we're going to have to wrap it up. We have 15 minutes, or we don't have 15 minutes?
Yeah, I'm just going to make sure to
Thank you.
So I think that often there is kind of a disconnect between the research that some of us produce, those of us who are not on the ground doing this work directly, and what is actually needed by folks like you all who are actually making real change. And so I'm just curious if there's particular research or there's data that you'd like to have to be able to do your work better that we as researchers are not collecting for you that we should be producing.
So let's take all the questions, and then we'll play with them. How does that go? Okay, Diamonds, you're up.
So my question specifically for Anthony, it's okay, I can do it.
There's someone filming.
Okay, well,
Steven, kind of fancy. Oh, sorry.
It's his microphone. They give you the bad one.
so I have a question
I don't have the mic.
Organizer. How can those who are kind of the systems leaders in various local communities create space for youth leadership in that transfer from, like you said, you've been doing a lot of work in getting the legislative reforms, but that policy to practice. So how can communities create space for youth voice and youth leadership in the implementation kind of phase?
Okay. And can you call it start?
Oh, wait.
So this is just a general question for the panel, but it's kind of a two-part question. But we talked a little bit earlier about language and the words that we use in describing various things. And so I was thinking when it comes to like the children family services, what is to be said about like the reporting method? A lot of within the Black community, a lot of the places that families turn to for help and for services are usually the ones that wind up reporting these children to the criminal justice system. So what is being done or what could be done to change the language around reporting and identifying maltreatment, identifying neglect, identifying poverty, and how can we what can be done to address, because we obviously don't want to scare people away from reporting things, but at the same time we don't want to label these children at a young age and these families, and thereby by punishing the parents we actually end up punishing the children. What could be said about that?
Okay, so we have a question about what research is needed. We want to hear from Anthony about how community organizations can make space for youth leadership. We want to
I think there is a humongous disconnect between the policymakers, the head district attorneys, the people who, the sheriffs, the police chiefs, and the criminal justice research world. And I've been to some, conferences with criminal justice sciences, and I have such a hard time finding meaningful data. I do see a lot of people doing metadata dumps, analyzing it, and then coming up with conclusions that are based on faulty premises. And unfortunately, I think if policymakers had better data, I think you'd get much better decision making. I just every time I look at a study that said this is the result, this is the conclusion we reach based on the data, I do a backtrack, and there's always very, very significant issues, meaning the person who did it may have been an academic and may have a PhD in statistics, but they haven't been in the criminal justice space, and so they don't understand that there was a big change in the law in that particular year, and the result that they think is significant is not significant for the following reasons. That happens quite frequently. I've never seen this in any other industry, by the way. I was a civil attorney before I was elected prosecutor in Long Beach, and a lot of other areas there are scientists coming up with data that it's very, very helpful and meaningful. At least from what I see, I don't see it in the criminal justice space from the policymaker side. I see a lot of data out there, but a lot of the data isn't particularly meaningful or good. I would love to partner with any researcher who wants to work with the prosecutor. I think there are a lot of other prosecutors that would too. They're not just going to take someone's conclusion and say, oh, well, that must be a good practice, let me do that. They're going to ask very difficult questions. But I think you'll find a lot of prosecutors, DAs, that are interested in it, but they're only interested in good data that has meaning to them in that space.
I'll just add this. Look, much of what we're all talking about here needs money to support it. And we all think our work is great. We're all in our little bubble like, wow, Boston's doing great stuff, New York, Long Beach. But to have objective research that can support that grant application or that ask of a foundation is hugely important. Up in Boston, we're very, very lucky with some wonderful partners in the research space, but they have been a huge help to us in securing funding to keeping the work going.
Yeah, I would say two things. One is particularly as information gets faster, but knowledge, like the production of knowledge is the same pace, we need longitudinal studies. We need people to just dig in and think 30 years forward or 40 years forward to really see sort of what those trajectories are. And please study women and girls in this space. There's just not enough on women and girls across settings so that you get the ends big enough to be meaningful. I think the other thing that I would say is translation of the data, right? That there is that gap between the practitioners and the policymakers and what the research scientists know and how they talk about it, but really have good translation for the field, for the counties, for the localities to be able to pick up and understand what is what are the 10 big things they should be looking at, or the 5 outcomes that they should be looking at, and what are the 3 process measures that they should be looking at. I think that sort of translational space could be really helpful.
Well, not so much about data in particular, but I think the conversation around like much of what was asked is a question of like diversity and inclusion, equitable representation, not just black, brown, like identity, but experiences. So like one of the fellowships I had, the first fellowship I ever had was with the Vera Institute of Justice, Vera Opportunity Fellowship. What I learned during that time not only was like the politics of policy and like the inner workings of that world, but the amount of manpower or people power that's needed in order to actually have like a substantial or significant impact and input into what's going on. I'll use an example. I like to use examples. They're very simple. If you have majority of the people in the room that are doing data and policy and they came from Stanford, they came from Harvard, they came from Oregon State University, and then you have one person who might have been through experience, firsthand experience with the criminal justice system, social justice system, whatever the case we want to call it, that doesn't factor into well. That equation's off base. And so this is why I bring up slavery. You're seeing the stratification of our world manifest through people not having fair opportunities. That doesn't mean everybody's gonna have the same outcome. So when you talk about policy, we have to talk about people are bringing themselves to it. I don't really believe in objectivity. I think you can get really close to it. I don't believe there's neutral. Everybody has these deep baked, kind of like implicit biases and like stigmas that they carry. So in order to kind of have attrition, that's a data term, have attrition, you need equitable representation across these fields so that we can have a more clear picture of what's actually going on and more voices are actually heard.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I wanted to answer the first question quickly too. I think some of the research we need to do it ourselves, and so we need to do more community-based research. You don't need to have a PhD to be doing research. Community members can do that. So we do our own community-based research. That doesn't mean we only use our research. We use research that is out there, but we also do our own. And so a few years ago, we wanted to go after the cow gang system in California because a lot of people were being designated or labeled gang associates and gang members when they weren't, and this had impacts on immigration. So you can be deported if you're labeled. You don't even have to commit a crime, but if ICE gets a hold of that you're a gang member, then that's grounds for removal. And just people being unfairly casting a wide dragnet and being criminalized and being stopped all the time because police suspect you're a gang associate or member. And so this cow gang system was completely secretive in California until we submitted PRAs and started getting data back and finding out that just about everybody on it was Black or Latino, and finding out that there's a lot of young people on it, and then writing our own report, the history of gang injunctions, the history of the cow gang system, before there was even a computerized system, and then laying out all the stats that we got from the PRAs, from the public records request, and putting that all into a report. And then that opened up scrutiny on the cow gang system, which led to an audit, which led to us passing AB 90, which now regulates, it has some community regulation on the cow gang system. And that was just all community-based research. And then for pushing to make space for youth, you gotta shove your way to the table. So the example of the youth development diversion program that's being implemented now in LA County. There was no community people on there, and there's no youth in this, and so we literally just came to the meetings with youth and just sat at the public meetings and then got into the work groups. Same with right now, LA County's working on risk assessment because California abolished cash bail. And in the work group, there was the sheriff's department, the DAs, all the typical departments that you would expect, and then the two community-based orgs that were invited to this work group were the ACLU and the Human Rights Watch. Now those are great orgs, but they're not community orgs, and they don't really have the ear of the community. And so we actually, us and a few other groups, kind of bum rushed that work group and sat in it. And so we just have to force your way to the table and bring youth. And then another way is another thing we do is we brainstorm. So after the end of the legislative year, we brainstorm with youth about what kind of world they want to see and what kind of those changes, because obviously you can't make all the changes in the world through policy, but that's one way to make change in the world. And what kind of policies, laws would you like to make? And so we get ideas from 5-year-olds to 24-year-olds and all that, and so we brainstorm ideas, and that becomes our platform. And then so it's really community-based ideas and policies. And then I think the biggest one is we have to find ways to pay youth to do these things. It's hard. Even for us, it's hard. All we can offer is a few stipends, which aren't that much, but at least trying to pay youth for their labor, because other people are getting paid for this. There's organizers that get paid. There's executive directors that are getting paid. All these different people are getting paid, but youth are always doing it for free and expected to tell their stories and expected to come through, and especially with all the other responsibilities they have, like school or work, whatever. So, yeah. Yeah, if you go on youthforjustice.org, you can find all the reports that we've done. We've done a few reports on different topics. Yeah, the number 4. Thank you.
Just to echo, because Anthony pretty much said it all, I think I'm going to speak to some of the character traits that are important for a lot of the work he's talking about. You want people to be able to have the ability to be discerning, which is not a clear-cut way of teaching that. You want people who actually know how to follow, and when the time calls for you following, because leadership is not just being in the forefront. Sometimes you have to know, like, oh, Ryan may be the better person to speak up on this issue, even though they may like my voice more. I can't speak on it the way Ryan's speaking on it, so I'm gonna play a supportive kind of like role in that aspect. Another thing you need to is realistic expectations. You need to have realistic expectations. This is something I still struggle with, because you'll come in, and this goes for anybody, you come into a space with your experience of how the world's supposed to work. You're cultivated the way you are, and then you're kind of adapting to a new space and culture. And so how do you mitigate between the two of those things? More importantly than that, I think we have, like, and I say we as in people in positions of power who are dictating who has these capabilities and qualities, we have to adjust our standard accordingly, and also have some of that same discernment when it's like, okay, representation, because this is where a lot of people get nervous about, what do they call it, affirmative action, where they're like, oh, somebody just got in the room because they're black or they're a woman or whatever the case may be. And it's like, no, we're doing a disservice if all perspectives, or as many perspectives as possible, aren't included. And so by you putting more value, and I don't want this particular person to come to the table because they're not as equipped in the way this culture works for that reason, you just lost a great opportunity for somebody to put some new innovative juice and life into what you're doing, and potentially expose you to something that your echo chamber has not allowed into the space. So we have to be more risk adverse, is a fancy word for that.